quiet doubt lingers. If the human mind was always capable, why did it wait so long to flare? For tens of thousands of years, the world kept footprints, ash and bone, yet the story reads like a torn page, as if something was lost between campsites. Researchers call it the cognitive revolution, roughly 70,000 years ago. But what turned murmurs into myths and tools into meaning? So before you let your body sink completely into this comfort, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. Please share your location and local time. It helps to begin where certainty feels safest, the body. Many researchers accept that anatomically, modern humans existed well before the date people love to circle. Fossils across Africa, dated by methods that are powerful but never perfectly silent, keep pushing recognizably modern traits backward. Hands already shaped for fine grips, faces built for subtle social reading, throats and tongues that, at least anatomically, seem ready for complex sound. The bones do not look like they are waiting, and yet when people look for the clearest footprints of symbolic life, objects made to mean something, actions that hint at invisible worlds, the trail becomes uneven for a long time, like a lamp that flickers instead of turning on. That flicker is where the question begins to feel less like science and more like a half-remembered dream. Ochre is carried and ground, shells are pierced, lines are carved into stone or bone with careful repetition. Burials appear that seem to do more than dispose of a body. Then the record goes quiet again, or quieter than the modern mind expects. It is tempting to treat that quiet as proof that nothing was happening inside the mind. But the earth is a careless archivist. Wood, fibre, feathers, skin, resin, paint on flesh. These are the likely materials of early meaning, and they rot. Coastlines drown. Rivers shuffle layers. Soil chemistry dissolves what a cave might have preserved. A human lifetime is long enough to hold stories. A geological heartbeat is long enough to erase them. This is why the date 70,000 can feel like a stage light rather than a sunrise. Some of the most plausible early human lives may have unfolded near coasts, where food was reliable and movement was easier. During glacial periods, sea levels were far lower, leaving broad coastal plains that are now submerged. If camps once sat there, if children once learned words and gestures there, then much of that archive lies underwater, scattered beneath marine sediments. The revolution could look sudden simply because the earlier chapters were drowned. And still, after a certain point, there are signs that become harder to dismiss as mere preservation bias. Tools begin to show chains of planning. A stone point is not just struck. It is paired with a shaft, secured with adhesives made by controlled heating and mixing. Work that implies foresight, patience, and an understanding of materials that cannot be learned by accident in a single afternoon. There are blades and microliths that suggest modular thinking, the idea that a broken part can be replaced without remaking the whole. Pigments appear not as random stains, but as curated substances, carried and processed with intention. A bead is small, but it is stubborn. It can declare identity without speaking. That last idea is the hinge. When a group agrees that something stands for something else, the group creates a tool that does not cut stone or scrape hide. It cuts uncertainty. It scrapes chaos into order. A symbol can say, this person is one of us. This is a boundary. This is mourning. This is promise. And when symbols begin to persist, humans begin to live inside shared meanings, rules and stories that exist outside any single body, yet move between bodies like a quiet current. So what could make shared meanings more frequent, more durable, more contagious? One family of explanations turns toward language, but not language as mere vocabulary. The suggestion is that humans crossed a threshold in the ability to build nested thought, to speak about what is absent, what is imagined, what is supposed to be true even when it is not visible. Tomorrow's hunt, a warning about a predator that is not here now, a promise that binds someone in the future, a story that makes strangers behave as if they share a past. The difficulty is that language leaves no fossils. There is no preserved sentence from 70,000 years ago to hold up to the light. Scholars infer language from anatomy, from genetics, from the complexity of social behaviour implied by archaeology, from the very fact that humans coordinate at scale. Famous candidates like FOXP2 have been discussed for decades, sometimes treated as if a single gene could unlock a cathedral. But the deeper one looks, the more the tidy story blurs. Variants appear in other hominins, timing becomes complicated. The reality of gene networks and development resists the simplicity of a switch. The mind, once again, refuses to confess to a single trigger. That resistance pushes attention towards something less dramatic, but possibly more powerful: population and connectivity. A brilliant idea can die if only a few people know it. A tool-making technique can vanish if the one who invented it is lost, if the group splits, if copying fails. Cultural knowledge does not automatically accumulate. It needs enough minds, close enough together for learning to outpace forgetting. Some researchers argue that once populations grow beyond a threshold, and once groups connect enough for ideas to circulate, innovation becomes self-sustaining. The revolution would then be social rather than neurological, not a new brain, but a new network. Why would networks thicken around that time? The world offers one persistent suspect: climate. The late Pleistocene was restless, punctuated by abrupt swings that could reshape habitats within the span of a few generations. Instability forces movement. It presses groups into new territories, into each other's paths, into competition and exchange. In such conditions, persuasion matters, reputation matters. Trust becomes a resource. A mind that can negotiate alliances, remember obligations, track deception, and coordinate with non-kin would have an advantage. Nothing mystical is required, only the quiet pressure of survival in a shifting world. Then there is ash, drifting through the story like a rumour. The Toba super eruption, dated to roughly 74,000 years ago, was real. Its signature is traced in deposits and climatic proxies across wide regions. The argument is about what it did to humans. One influential hypothesis proposed a severe bottleneck, a near collapse that reshaped genetic diversity and forced social reorganization. Others point to evidence of continuity at certain sites and question whether the catastrophe was as globally crushing as the most dramatic versions suggest. The dispute is not a side note. It reveals a modern longing for one clean spark, a single disaster that can be pointed to, named, and filed as the cause. Deep time rarely grants such neatness. Catastrophe may have played a role in some places, not others. Climate instability may have sharpened flexibility without altering brains. Population thresholds may have allowed culture to stop evaporating. Language may have deepened gradually, passing a point where symbols could carry heavier loads. The mind may have been capable long before, yet the world may not have been the kind of world where that capability could reliably survive, replicate, and spread. And beneath all of that, a subtler unease begins to form, one that does not accuse any ancient group of malice, but notices an enduring human vulnerability. The moment symbols become powerful, they become dangerous. Shared stories can bind people into cooperation. They can also bind people into obedience. A symbol can heal grief. It can also be used to direct fear. Even without formal institutions, prestige and persuasion exist. The storyteller exists. The charismatic figure who frames misfortune as destiny exists. The earliest invisible rules were not laws written on stone. They were agreements written in attention. So the question shifts slightly, the way a shadow shifts when the fire changes. Instead of asking only what lit the mind, it becomes necessary to ask what the mind began to light in others. If culture started behaving like a self-sustaining force, stacking, accumulating, surviving its creators, then humans stepped into a new kind of habitat, one made of ideas. And habitats can nourish, but they can also trap. That is where the mystery remains. Not a single spark, but a convergence. A world that grew unstable, groups that grew large enough and connected enough, technologies and symbols that began to persist. Perhaps no one moment triggered the cognitive revolution. Perhaps the more unsettling truth is that the revolution is what it feels like when meaning becomes durable, when humans begin to carry invisible worlds between them, and those worlds begin quietly to carry humans back. What then was truly born around that time? A new kind of intelligence, or a new kind of captivity? The date that people repeat, 70,000 years give or take, begins to feel less like a point on a timeline and more like a bright island surrounded by fog. If the mind was already capable, then the fog is not proof of emptiness. It may be proof of erasure, not the dramatic erasure of a library set on fire, but the slow, indifferent erasure of the earth itself. Archaeologists live with this indifference every day. Stone survives because stone is stubborn. But much of human life is made from materials that decay with almost theatrical speed. Wood handles, fibre cords, woven containers, feather ornaments, skin drums, painted bodies, carved bark. Even the most meaningful objects can be made of the most fragile things. If early symbolism was carried in voice, rhythm, gesture and ritual, performed rather than stored, then the past would leave little behind, even if it was rich beyond imagination. A culture can be complex and still vanish into almost nothing if its archive is made of breath and plant. That is why preservation is not a technical footnote. It is a force that shapes what modern people are allowed to believe. The past is not simply discovered. It is filtered by chemistry, geology, and chance. A dry cave might protect ashen pigment for tens of thousands of years. A humid open-air campsite might dissolve into anonymity. A single flood can mix layers and scramble chronology. A burrowing animal can pierce a timeline with its tunnels. The most ancient stories are therefore told by rare places, sheltered, dry, lucky, rather than by the most typical places where humans actually lived. And where did humans likely live? Often near predictable food and water. In the late Pleistocene, coastlines would have been powerful magnets. Sea levels were much lower during glacial times, exposing broad coastal plains where people could harvest shellfish, fish, seabirds, and sea mammals. These plains offered stability in a world that often did not. Then, as ice sheets melted, seas rose and swallowed those plains. The shoreline moved inland, drowning camps and pathways, scattering middens, burying hearths under sediments. If the earliest modern behaviours were concentrated in those coastal zones, as many researchers consider plausible, then the archive that would best answer modern questions is now underwater. This complicates the story in a way that feels almost unfair. It means the beginning of symbolic behaviour might not be waiting in a cave at all. It might be resting beneath waves, beyond the reach of most excavation, beyond the comfort of easy narratives. It means there could have been long traditions of ornamentation, music and ritual whose traces are now mute because their landscapes have been erased. Even on land, the record is shaped by where people have looked. Research is not evenly distributed across continents. Some regions have been surveyed and excavated intensely for generations. Others remain comparatively underexplored, often for reasons that have nothing to do with science: political instability, funding disparities, inaccessible terrain, colonial legacies, and the quiet biases of academic fashion. The revolution can therefore mirror the map of modern scholarship. The densest clusters of evidence can reflect the densest clusters of fieldwork. Time itself also resists clean storylines. Dates in archaeology are not simple labels pinned to objects. They are estimates built from charcoal fragments, sediment layers, luminescent signals, and the behaviour of isotopes, each with uncertainties that can stretch across centuries or more. Those uncertainties are not failures, they are the honest cost of working at the edge of measurable time. But they do mean that suddenness can be an illusion. A cluster of dates can look like a burst simply because the error bars overlap, or because the surviving sites happen to fall within a window that modern methods can resolve more confidently. This is why some scholars have grown cautious with the word revolution. The older idea of a sudden behavioural transformation, especially when framed around Europe's Upper Paleolithic record, has been challenged by evidence for earlier symbolic practices in Africa and elsewhere. The picture that emerges is less like a switch and more like a mosaic. Different components of modern behaviour appearing in different places at different times, pigment use in one region, long-distance exchange in another, complex tool traditions somewhere else, and burials with possible symbolic elements elsewhere again. When modern people gather these elements into a single bundle, it can look like a packaged leap. But deep history rarely arrives prepackaged, and yet the mosaic does not erase the question. Because even if symbolism appeared earlier, something seems to change in how often it appears, how widely it spreads, and how persistently it endures. The issue may not be invention, it may be retention. An innovation can arise repeatedly and still vanish repeatedly until conditions allow it to stick, until enough people share it, copy it, teach it, and carry it across generations. Here, a quieter mechanism begins to matter: population size and connectivity. When groups are small and isolated, culture behaves like a candle in wind. A technique, a style, a ritual, any of these can die with a few individuals. But when populations grow and groups connect, culture becomes more stable, ideas travel, mistakes are corrected by comparison, skills are preserved by redundancy. In such networks, even small symbols can harden into tradition, and traditions can harden into rules. This offers a possible way to understand why the archaeological record begins to look different after a certain period without requiring a sudden mutation in the brain. The brain may have been capable, the social world may have become a better incubator. A thicker network can make the same mind appear more inventive simply because it is supported by more minds. There is, however, a deeper unease hiding inside this explanation. If the story of a cognitive revolution is partly shaped by preservation and sampling, then certainty becomes a kind of performance. The human mind is eager to find beginnings, eager to locate a single trigger, eager to turn complexity into a neat pivot point. That eagerness can masquerade as insight. It can create a clean drama where the past offered only slow accumulation and scattered sparks. And when the modern mind insists on a clean drama, it risks repeating a pattern that appears again and again in later history. The tendency to compress messy processes into official turning points, to elevate a few surviving artifacts into symbols of an era, to treat absence as proof that nothing existed. In recent centuries, institutions can shape archives deliberately, by preserving, censoring, or destroying. In deep prehistory, the shaping is done by nature and by scholarly attention, rather than by emperors and priests. Yet the effect can look strangely similar. Whole chapters missing, and the remaining chapters made to carry more meaning than they were ever meant to bear. So the fog thickens, and the island of 70,000 years begins to look less authoritative. The question becomes heavier because it now includes the machinery of interpretation itself. If the archive is incomplete, then the trigger might not be a single event at all. It might be a threshold, reached at different times in different places, where culture stopped evaporating fast enough to be remembered. And this leaves one detail hovering in the quiet. If the revolution is partly a story we tell to explain gaps, then what else in deep history might be shaped by the same hunger for neat origins? When modern people point to a bright island and call it a beginning, are they seeing the past, or are they revealing their own need to be certain about a darkness that will never fully give up its shape? The darkness does not lift just because a theory feels elegant. If anything, the more carefully the past is examined, the more the questions begin to sound like echoes. When the archive is incomplete, every explanation risks becoming a mirror, yet the world itself did change, again and again, during the long span when humans were learning how to be human. And one cannot ignore the possibility that the mind did not suddenly awaken, but that the planet kept shaking the cradle until certain forms of thinking became unavoidable. Late Pleistocene climates were not gentle backdrops. They were restless, swinging between cold and warm phases with abruptness that could compress a lifetime into an era. Landscapes that had been familiar could become strangers, grasslands turning to scrub, forests retreating, water sources shifting, prey migrating along new routes. A group that had survived by habit might find habit useless within a few decades. In such a world, the most valuable trait is not strength or even skill, but adaptability, an ability to change strategies, revise expectations, and learn quickly from hints. That kind of adaptability can be described without romantic language. It is an evolutionary bargain. When conditions fluctuate, selection can favour flexible behaviour, better memory for social and ecological detail, and a stronger capacity for planning across time. But this does not require imagining a dramatic mutation. It can be achieved through the sharpening of existing capacities, and through the fact that learning itself becomes more precious when the environment is unpredictable. A mind that can model tomorrow becomes a mind that survives. The simplest version of this idea is pressure. Scarcity forces innovation. But scarcity alone is too blunt to explain symbolic life. A starving human can invent a sharper point, yet still never carve a pattern into bone. Something more social seems necessary, the way groups respond to stress by reorganizing. Climate volatility can push people closer together or drive them apart. It can increase encounters between groups competing for the same resources, and it can also create opportunities for exchange. Knowledge traded like food, alliances forged like tools. When strangers meet repeatedly, the rules of life change. In a small, familiar band, reputation is personal and immediate. Everyone knows everyone's history. But in a world of frequent encounters, identity becomes something that must be signalled. A bead, a pigment pattern, a particular way of shaping a tool, these can become passports. They allow quick categorization: friend, rival, potential mate, potential threat. Symbolic markers begin to matter not as art, but as survival shortcuts in a social landscape that has become larger than memory. This is one reason some researchers treat ornaments and pigments as more than decoration. They can be read as technology, social technology. A pattern worn on the body can reduce uncertainty. It can communicate belonging without the need for long conversation. It can stabilize cooperation, and cooperation, in turn, becomes more vital when the environment is unstable, because no individual can hedge against every risk alone. Shared storage, shared hunting, shared childcare, shared information. These are the invisible infrastructures that allow a species to move through volatility. Another subtle possibility emerges here, that the so-called revolution was not a leap into imagination, but a leap into coordination. Humans may have always been capable of symbolic thought, but symbolic systems may only become widespread when social conditions reward them. In a stable environment, a group can survive with routines and implicit understanding. In an unstable environment, explicit signals, explicit commitments, and shared narratives become tools for keeping a group intact when everything else is shifting. Yet, there is an uncomfortable counterpoint. Climate volatility does not only reward cooperation, it also rewards suspicion. When resources are scarce, deception becomes more tempting. When strangers arrive, fear becomes rational. This can intensify the social mind's darker talents, the ability to track alliances, detect betrayal, punish defectors, and enforce norms. Symbolic rules can protect a group, but they can also harden into boundaries that justify exclusion. A shared story can unite, but it can also create outsiders. This is where the idea of shared fictions becomes more than a clever phrase. A shared fiction is not necessarily a lie. It is an agreement about what matters. It is a way of making invisible obligations real. It can be the belief that a certain animal is sacred, that a certain ancestor watches, that a certain place must not be violated. These beliefs can regulate behavior in ways that increase group cohesion and predictability. In volatile climates, predictability is a kind of shelter. Some scholars point to the possibility that early myth-making and ritual offered psychological stability. When the world is unpredictable, the mind seeks patterns, because patterns are comforting and useful. A ritual can create the illusion of control, but it can also create real coordination. People gather, synchronize, share emotion, and strengthen bonds. Over time, these shared practices can become engines of cultural transmission. Children inherit not just tools, but frameworks for interpreting uncertainty. The cognitive revolution, in this light, looks less like an invention and more like a response. The mind learning to build internal shelter against external chaos. Still, the Earth refuses to provide a single climactic scene. The idea that climate alone triggered the change remains insufficient. Volatility existed before, scarcity existed before, and yet the density of symbolic traces increases and the human expansion across the globe accelerates. So climate may be part of the pressure, but it may not be the match. The match could be the network itself, the moment when enough people were close enough, often enough for culture to become cumulative. In that case, climate is the wind that drives movement and encounter, while connectivity is the fire that spreads. There is also the question of timing and region. 70,000 years ago is a convenient anchor, but different areas show different trajectories. Some places reveal earlier symbolic practices, others reveal later intensifications. This variability suggests that what modern people call a revolution may be a collection of thresholds reached under different circumstances, not a single event that washed across humanity like a wave. And so the story holds two truths at once. The planet changed, humans moved, encounters increased, the social environment thickened with risks and opportunities. Under that pressure, symbols became more than decoration. They became instruments of navigation in a complex human landscape. And yet, because the record is incomplete, and the process likely uneven, the temptation to declare a single trigger may itself be a kind of modern myth, a story told to satisfy the nervous need for clarity. The unease deepens because it suggests a paradox. The same mind that once learned to use symbols to survive volatility is the mind that now uses symbols to impose certainty on a past that will never fully reveal itself. The listener is left with a question that is not a conclusion, but a doorway. If climate and instability helped humans build meaning as shelter, then what happens when a meaning becomes so central that it begins to shape reality more than reality shapes it? When did humans stop adapting to the world and start adapting the world to their stories? Ash has a peculiar way of entering human memory. It falls without intention, coats everything equally, then waits, sometimes for tens of thousands of years, until someone scrapes it from a layer of earth and wonders what kind of day it once was. In the search for a trigger, few candidates have been as seductive as a disaster that can be measured. The Toba super eruption, dated to around 74,000 years ago, leaving traces from Sumatra across wide regions. The eruption happened. The argument is what it did to minds that left no written testimony. One version of the story is almost too perfect. A volcanic winter, a collapsing food web, human populations shrinking to a narrow thread, a genetic bottleneck so severe it nearly ends the species. Then from that thread a rebirth, survivors forced into closer cooperation, sharper planning, deeper language, richer symbolism, because only coordinated meaning could carry them through the cold. It is the kind of narrative that feels like a myth with scientific clothing. Catastrophe as purification, near extinction as initiation, a species frightened into intelligence, But the closer researchers lean in, the more the fabric shows seams. Genetic evidence has been read in multiple ways, and not all readings demand a single dramatic bottleneck at that moment. Archaeological sequences in some regions suggest continuity rather than collapse, as if certain human groups endured without the total break the dramatic story requires. Climate records show complexity. Effects may have been severe in some places, moderated in others, uneven across landscapes. A disaster can be global in ash and still be local in consequence. The planet does not distribute suffering with perfect symmetry. This is where the question becomes more unsettling rather than less. Because if Toba was not the universal near ending, then the desire to make it one reveals something about modern thinking. There is a hunger for a single cause, a single choke point where history can be forced through a narrow gate. It makes the past feel controllable. It makes an enormous transformation feel explainable. It allows the mind to relax. It was the volcano. It was the cold. It was the bottleneck. The story closes itself, yet deep history rarely closes. If Toba mattered, it may have mattered in a quieter way, not as a scythe that cut humanity down to almost nothing, but as a disturbance that rearranged the social landscape. Even without near extinction, a period of harsh conditions could change migration routes, alter prey distribution, and push groups into new territories. It could intensify competition and contact. It could force innovations in food processing, shelter, clothing, and tool use. It could make planning across seasons more urgent. In that sense, catastrophe would not create symbolic thought from nothing. It would raise the value of any cognitive skill that helped groups coordinate under stress. But there is another possibility that sits like a shadow behind the ash, that the real bottleneck, if there was one, was cultural rather than genetic. Imagine groups shrinking and fragmenting, not to a single surviving clan, but into isolated pockets. In isolation, ideas die quickly, skills become brittle, traditions collapse if there are too few teachers. When conditions later improve and groups reconnect, the survivors may not simply resume old patterns, they may rebuild with whatever fragments remained. A long chain of cultural transmission can be snapped without leaving a clear mark in bones. The mind stays the same, but the shared memory outside the mind is erased. This notion is difficult to prove, which is exactly why it lingers. Culture is the most precious archive and the easiest to lose. In later eras, when a language disappears, whole worlds of classification and metaphor disappear with it. In prehistory, such disappearances could happen without leaving even a whisper, because the archive was carried in living bodies. If harsh conditions repeatedly thinned populations and broke networks, humanity may have experienced multiple, soft resets. Not the end of the species, but the end of certain accumulated traditions. That begins to sound like the kind of claim that invites conspiracy thinking, so it must be handled with care. A soft reset does not require an enemy or a hidden hand. It requires only ecological fragility and demographic chance. Still, it introduces a haunting thought. The cognitive revolution might look dramatic because earlier cultural highs were repeatedly erased. The suddenness would then be an artifact of survival. This time, the spark finally caught long enough to spread. And once that thought enters, the listener may notice how often modern narratives underestimate loss. The deep past is routinely described as simple, not necessarily because it was simple, but because simplicity survives better in the archive. A few stone tools can imply a whole way of life, but they cannot show the full complexity of social rules, storytelling, ritual performance, humour, taboo, lullaby, grief. If those invisible structures were present earlier, then the timeline of awakening becomes less a line and more a pulse. Moments of intensity separated by absences that may be more about erasure than about emptiness. Toba, in this frame, becomes one example of a broader pattern. The Earth periodically interrupts cultural accumulation. Volcanoes, droughts, rapid climate swings, shifting coastlines, disease dynamics in small populations, all can thin networks and reset social memory. None of these forces are visible in a single artifact. They are inferred from layers, proxies, and the uneasy gaps between sites. There is also a psychological temptation that must be resisted. To treat catastrophe as automatically creative. Hardship can sharpen cooperation, but it can also shrink horizons. Under extreme stress, groups may become more conservative, less experimental, more focused on immediate survival. Innovation requires spare attention. Symbolism requires time. Ritual requires energy. A starving group might strip life down to essentials and abandon ornamentation, even if the mind remains capable. That could make the archaeological record look like regression, not progress, even if cognitive capacity did not change at all. So, the ash cannot be a simple answer. It is, at most, a pressure, a disturbance, a possible accelerator in some regions and a possible eraser in others. Yet it remains important because it illustrates the kind of event that forces humans into the borderlands, where culture either collapses or becomes indispensable. When survival depends on coordinated action, trust becomes a resource, and when trust must be maintained across fear, symbols become tools, signs of belonging, markers of obligation, shared stories that hold a group together when reality is unstable. There is a faint echo here of later history, where crises often lead to stronger narratives, tighter identities, and more powerful institutions. In those later cases, the forces that hold people together can become forces that control them. The same glue that binds can harden into constraint. In deep prehistory, there were no formal states, no written doctrines, no centralized archives, yet the cognitive ingredients that later make such systems possible may have been strengthening. The ability to believe collectively, to obey invisible rules, to punish deviation, to find comfort in shared explanations. So the question slips again, becoming less about a single volcanic winter and more about what repeated disturbance does to a species that stores its survival strategies and culture. If the deep past was punctuated by resets, hard and soft, then the cognitive revolution might not be a moment of birth, but a moment of persistence. The first time symbolic systems endured long enough to become self-reinforcing across wide networks. And that raises the next doubt, quiet but sharp. If catastrophe can erase culture without killing the species, then how many times might humans have built complex symbolic worlds only to lose them? How many revolutions, in other words, might have happened in silence, burned away by ash and water, leaving only this one to be named, measured, and remembered? A revolution that appears once may simply be the only one that survived long enough to leave fingerprints. That thought is uncomfortable, because it makes history feel less like a straight road and more like a shoreline, constantly redrawn, constantly losing its earlier footprints. If the deep past was punctuated by erasures, then the question of a trigger becomes inseparable from a quieter question. What conditions allow an idea to persist, not merely to appear? Here the mind is tempted to look inward again, toward genes and neurons, as if permanence must be biological. Yet many researchers argue that permanence in human history is often demographic. A population is not just a number of bodies, it is a number of minds available to hold, teach, and correct cultural information. When that number is small, knowledge behaves like a rumour. It can vanish with a few unlucky deaths. When that number is large and connected, knowledge behaves like an organism. It reproduces, mutates, competes, and adapts. This is the logic behind the idea of cumulative culture. Humans do not merely invent, they stack. They refine tools across generations. They keep improvements, discard failures, and pass down techniques that no single individual could discover alone within a lifetime. But cumulative culture is fragile. It requires sufficient social learning, sufficient interaction, and enough redundancy that a skill does not die when one expert dies. In very small groups, even a bright mind can be trapped in a loop of reinvention. rediscovering the same solutions because there are too few teachers to stabilize improvements. Some scholars have tried to show this with models. When population size and connectivity increase, the probability that complex technologies and symbolic traditions persist rises sharply. This does not mean that intelligence suddenly increases. It means the social storage space expands. The group becomes a memory system. In that sense, the revolution could be a threshold in the capacity of the collective to hold complexity. If that is true, then the late Pleistocene is not only a story of brains, it is a story of networks. It is a story of how often groups met, how much they exchanged, how far they travelled, how stable their social ties were across seasons. It is also a story of how many children survived long enough to learn, because culture is transmitted disproportionately through youth. A world that becomes slightly less lethal to children can become dramatically more fertile for ideas. This moves the mystery into an almost intimate space. The trigger might not be a dramatic event at all. It might be a slow easing in mortality, a subtle shift in resource reliability, a change in mobility patterns that increases contact, or a growth in regional population density that turns isolated bands into interacting communities. Such changes would rarely leave a single unmistakable mark in the archaeological record, yet they could transform what kinds of behaviours persist and spread. And now the evidence begins to look different. Long-distance transport of materials, shells moved inland, obsidian moved across regions, can be interpreted as more than trade in objects. It can be trade in relationships. Shared styles in tool-making can suggest learning across group boundaries. Ornaments can imply identity systems that extend beyond a single camp. These are faint signals, but they hint at something profound, the possibility that humans were becoming less local in their minds. Strangers were becoming part of the social landscape rather than an occasional anomaly. Once strangers are part of the landscape, symbols gain power. A symbol is portable. It is a compressed message that can travel across distance without constant explanation. It can say ally or kin or trusted before any words are exchanged. It can also say outsider. This is the double edge of the social revolution. The same mechanisms that allow cooperation at scale can also allow exclusion at scale. So the story widens. The cognitive revolution may not only be about new capacities, but about new costs. A larger network requires more regulation. It demands norms, taboos, reputational systems, and shared narratives that keep cooperation from collapsing under the weight of free-riding and conflict. In small bands, personal knowledge can police behaviour. In larger systems, symbolic systems must do the policing. Stories about ancestors, spirits, obligations, and consequences that cannot be seen but must be feared or respected. It is here that myth and ritual return, not as quaint ornamentation, but as infrastructure. A ritual can synchronize bodies and emotions, reinforcing cohesion. A shared origin story can reduce internal conflict by defining a common we. A taboo can protect a scarce resource by framing restraint as sacred rather than optional. In this view, symbolic culture is a technology that stabilizes networks. The unsettling question is whether such stabilization requires a certain kind of psychological leverage. Humans are unusually responsive to imagined watchers, to moralized narratives, to reputational threat. These traits can bind groups, but they can also be exploited. One does not need formal institutions for exploitation to begin. One needs only influence. A persuasive figure who claims special access to meaning. A storyteller whose interpretation becomes law. A group that learns under stress that unity matters more than doubt. This is not an accusation against ancient humans. It is simply an acknowledgement of how social systems behave. Once ideas become shared, they can be contested. Once symbols matter, people compete over what symbols mean. And once networks expand, the struggle over meaning becomes a struggle over power, even in small and informal forms. The trigger then could be described as a shift in scale. The human world became large enough that meaning had to become explicit and portable. The mind had to learn to live not only with reality, but with reputation, identity, and collective belief. The revolution is what it feels like when humans begin to inhabit a second environment, a social atmosphere made of agreements, expectations, and stories. But the listener might notice a quiet circularity. If population density and connectivity are the engine, what increased them in the first place? Climate stability in some corridors, perhaps. Ecological opportunities. Technological improvements that reduced risk. The domestication of fire use in broader contexts. Better clothing. Improved hunting strategies. Each could slightly expand carrying capacity, allowing more people to live in a region, which increases encounters, which increases cultural accumulation, which improves survival, which increases population further. A feedback loop. The mind and the network co-evolving in slow acceleration. This is why the search for a single trigger keeps failing. The system may have been self-amplifying. Once certain thresholds were crossed, culture began to compound. The revolution would then be less like a spark and more like a tipping point. Quiet, invisible, and only obvious in hindsight when the curve of human behaviour begins to climb. And still, the unease returns. If the turning point was a demographic and social threshold, then it is also fragile. If networks thin, culture can collapse. If populations fragment, knowledge can evaporate. If the human collective is the archive, then the archive can burn without flames, through dispersion, isolation, and loss. So the next question emerges like a distant shape in fog. If cumulative culture depends on dense, connected populations, then what happens when those networks are disrupted? How many times might the human story have approached a tipping point, only to slide back into silence? And how close did the species come repeatedly to forgetting itself? Forgetting does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, like a familiar path covered by wind-blown sand. If the human archive is carried in living networks, then disruption can erase more than lives. It can erase techniques, songs, taboos, and the delicate ways people once explained the world to children by firelight. The unsettling possibility is not merely that symbolic culture emerged, but that it may have emerged more than once, and that the surviving evidence captures only the occasions when it endured. This is why certain artifacts feel almost too small for the weight placed upon them. A pierced shell, a smear of ochre, a few lines engraved with deliberate repetition. These objects are modest, yet they're treated like gateways into the modern mind. Perhaps that is appropriate, because meaning is often hidden in modest things. A bead does not feed anyone, it does not shelter anyone. It exists to be seen, and to be seen is to be recognized. Recognition is social. It depends on others agreeing, even silently, that the object matters. When archaeologists find early beads, they sometimes speak of personal ornamentation, as if the self is the natural centre of the story. But ornamentation can also be collective. It can declare group membership. It can mark life stages. It can encode alliances. In unstable environments and expanding networks, such visible markers become a kind of social shorthand. They allow identity to be communicated quickly, even across language differences or first encounters. Ochre, too, carries an ambiguity that invites both caution and fascination. Red pigments can have practical uses, hide preservation, insect repellent, sun protection. Yet ochre also appears in contexts that feel ritualized, stored and transported with care. The colour red can be associated with blood, life, death and transformation in many later cultures, but it would be a mistake to project later symbolism backward with confidence. Still, it is difficult to ignore that pigment is a medium for making the body into a message. To paint skin is to declare that the visible self is not enough. Something must be added, emphasized, transformed, and then there are burials. Few traces of early human behaviour provoke as much projection as the intentional placement of the dead. Some burials appear to involve careful positioning, perhaps even grave goods, though interpretations differ. It is tempting to say, here religion begins, here the afterlife begins, here the symbolic mind announces itself. Yet burials can also be practical, protecting a group from scavengers, reducing disease risk, expressing grief without metaphysical claims. The problem is that grief itself is already a doorway to symbolism. Even if early burials were practical, the act of treating a body with care suggests that social bonds persist beyond utility. The record of early symbolic behaviour is therefore not one thing but a cluster of hints. When these hints appear across different regions and times, the mind strains to find a pattern. Some scholars argue for a gradual accumulation of symbolic practices, earlier than once believed, with pulses and pauses. Others propose that what looks like early symbolism may sometimes be ambiguous behaviour that modern humans interpret through their own symbolic obsession. Both positions carry truth. The past is both richer than we can see and harder to interpret than we want to admit. What makes the period around 70,000 years ago so persistent in public imagination is not only the presence of symbolism, but the sense of acceleration afterward. More frequent ornaments, more diverse toolkits, wider dispersal across landscapes. The question becomes, why does symbolism begin to appear not merely as isolated sparks, but as a pattern that repeats and spreads? One answer returns to the idea of apprenticeship. Complex behaviours require teaching. Teaching requires time and patience. Time is a resource. When survival is precarious, time is swallowed by immediate needs. But when groups reach a threshold of stability, through technology, social support, or ecological opportunities, there may be more time for deliberate instruction. Children can learn not only to make tools, but to interpret meanings. They can be raised inside a world of shared symbols, rather than encountering symbols as occasional adornments. This shifts attention to the structure of human childhood. Humans have unusually long developmental periods compared to many animals. Long childhood can be costly, but it also creates space for learning. Some researchers have argued that subtle changes in life history, slightly longer periods of dependency, slightly different patterns of social care, could expand cultural transmission dramatically. Again, this does not require a sudden genetic revolution. It requires only small shifts that favour the accumulation and retention of learned behaviour. Still, the artefacts themselves remain the anchor. A bead implies a shared visual language, yay. A repeated engraved pattern implies attention to form beyond utility. A burial implies social continuity beyond death. These are not proofs of a single trigger, but they are proofs that the human world was beginning to thicken with invisible things, and invisible things have consequences. Once symbols exist, they invite interpretation. Interpretation invites disagreement. Disagreement invites authority. Someone who claims to know what a symbol really means. This can happen at any scale, even within a small band. A respected elder, a skilled healer, a persuasive storyteller. The past does not need formal institutions to generate power dynamics. It needs only the human tendency to seek coherence and to defer to confident narratives. This is where the theme of control begins to flicker, not as an accusation, but as an observation about what symbolic systems enable. If shared meanings become the glue of cooperation, they also become the leverage of influence. A group can be guided by stories that shape fear and hope. In later millennia, this becomes visible in religion, empire, and ideology. In the late Pleistocene, it would be softer, more intimate, perhaps barely distinguishable from tradition. But the cognitive ingredients may already have been forming: the capacity to believe collectively, to obey invisible rules, to sacrifice immediate desire for symbolic obligation. The tension, then, is not between science and mystery, but between two honest limitations. The first is the limitation of evidence. The second is the limitation of interpretation. Archaeology can show objects, not meanings. It can show pigments, not the emotions they carried. It can show the arrangement of bones, not the thoughts that knelt beside them. Modern humans must infer, and inference is always haunted by the risk of projection. Yet even projection is revealing. The urge to see early beads as the beginning of selfhood, or early burials as the beginning of religion, tells us something about what modern people fear and desire. They want an origin story for meaning. They want a moment when the human became truly human. That desire is itself a product of symbolic consciousness, so the artifacts remain as quiet witnesses, small, stubborn, incomplete. They do not confess to a single trigger. They only indicate that the human world was becoming layered, that the visible surface of life was being coated with significance. And the question that drifts forward is both simple and heavy. If symbols began to persist because networks grew and learning deepened, what was the first symbol powerful enough to change behavior at scale? Was it an ornament, a ritual, a taboo, or a story? One that made humans act together not merely because they needed to, but because they believed they must. A story can be more binding than hunger. Hunger can be negotiated. A story can feel unquestionable. When a group begins to act not only on what is seen, but on what is believed, behavior changes in a way that leaves few physical traces yet reshapes everything. This is why the search for the first truly powerful symbol keeps circling back to one invisible tool: language. Not language as a list of words, but language as a structure that allows minds to synchronize. It is one thing to name objects. It is another to describe relationships between objects across time, to embed clauses inside clauses, to build a sentence that carries a plan, a warning, a lie, or a moral. Some researchers have argued that the most decisive cognitive threshold would be recursion, the ability to nest ideas and thereby generate infinite meaning from finite parts. A mind that can do this can imagine not only what is, but what could be. It can simulate futures, rehearse alternatives, and construct narratives that guide group behavior. The difficulty is that this threshold, if it exists, would leave no fossil. There is no preserved grammar. There are only indirect clues: the anatomy of the vocal tract, the neural architecture inferred from brain endocasts, patterns in tool complexity, evidence of long-distance exchange, and the spread of symbolic artifacts. Even these clues can be read in multiple ways. A complex tool does not prove complex language. A bead does not prove recursion. The past does not provide clean experiments. Yet the human world makes one point difficult to avoid. Once language becomes capable of describing the absent, it transforms social life. It allows a group to coordinate beyond immediate perception. It allows the sharing of knowledge about distant places, rare events, and unseen dangers. It allows individuals to build reputations that travel ahead of them. He is trustworthy. She cheated. They are dangerous. In this way, language can extend social control across distance and time. This extension may be one of the quiet engines behind cumulative culture. Teaching a complex technique is far easier with precise communication. Explaining how to mix an adhesive, how to heat treat stone, how to set a trap, how to avoid poisoning, these are tasks that benefit enormously from detailed instruction. The longer the apprenticeship, the more valuable language becomes. And as language becomes more valuable, the social environment selects for those who can use it effectively, not necessarily through sudden genetic change, but through cultural reinforcement and social prestige. Still, the idea of a sudden linguistic mutation is seductive, and it has been proposed in different forms. Some narratives suggest a single neurological tweak that unlocked advanced syntax and imagination. Others point to gene candidates and developmental shifts. But such stories risk repeating the same pattern. the craving for a single trigger. Biology rarely cooperates with that craving. Traits emerge through networks of genes and developmental processes, and they interact with culture in feedback loops that are hard to untangle. A more plausible picture, suggested by many scholars, is gradual enhancement. Language may have existed in some form long before, but its expressive power and social centrality may have increased as group sizes grew and as cooperation became more complex. In such a scenario, language does not appear. It intensifies. It becomes a stronger force in shaping behavior. It becomes capable of carrying larger shared fictions. And shared fictions matter because humans can cooperate flexibly with non-kin when they believe they share a framework. A group can be held together by the belief that they descend from a common ancestor, even if that ancestor is a myth. They can coordinate because they accept a taboo, even if the taboo has no direct physical enforcement. They can sacrifice immediate advantage because they fear shame, spirits, or exclusion. These are invisible pressures, yet they create real outcomes. If language made such pressures transmissible, then it also made them scalable. It allowed norms to be explained, defended, and weaponized. It allowed conflicts to be justified. It allowed persuasion to become an adaptive skill. A mind that can tell the most compelling story can shape group decisions, sometimes subtly, sometimes decisively. This is where the cognitive revolution begins to look like the birth of a new kind of vulnerability. A species that can be guided by stories can also be misled by them. Deception becomes more sophisticated when it can be packaged in narrative. A lie can be delivered not as a blunt falsehood, but as a plausible sequence of causes and effects. It can appeal to fear, hope, or loyalty. Language allows not only cooperation, but manipulation. Some evolutionary psychologists have argued that much of human intelligence evolved not to solve physics problems, but to navigate social complexity. In that view, language is a tool for alliance building, status negotiation, and reputation management. It is a weapon as much as a bridge. Whether or not one agrees with all aspects of this framing, it aligns with a simple observation. Humans speak constantly about humans. They speak about who did what, who should be trusted, who broke a rule. Gossip may sound trivial, but it is a mechanism for maintaining social order. A group that can punish defectors through reputation can cooperate more effectively. Language makes reputation portable. If so, then the period when networks expanded and symbolic systems became more visible could also be the period when reputation began to carry more weight than physical force. A person might be punished not by blows but by exclusion. Exclusion in a harsh world can be a death sentence. That gives symbolic systems their teeth. Rules do not need to be written if everyone fears being cast out, and this returns the mind to the strange quiet of early artifacts. A bead is not only decoration, it is a signal. Pigment is not only colour, it is identity. A burial is not only disposal, it is a statement about belonging and continuity. These behaviours become more potent in a world where language can explain and enforce them, where stories can make them feel sacred, inevitable, binding. The question then shifts again, from what language is to what language did to time. With advanced narrative, humans can inhabit the past and the future. They can mourn not only what is lost but what could have been. They can fear not only immediate threats but imagined catastrophes. They can plan across seasons, across lifetimes, perhaps even across generations. This temporal expansion is a cognitive transformation. It changes what decisions feel reasonable. It changes what sacrifices feel meaningful. It makes long-term projects possible. But temporal expansion has a cost. A mind that can imagine futures can also imagine doom. A mind that can remember in detail can also relive trauma. A mind that can construct narratives can also become trapped inside them. The cognitive revolution, if it was a deepening of language and narrative capacity, may have given humans both a lantern and a labyrinth. So the next layer of fog forms around a delicate question. If language intensified and made shared fictions scalable, what was the first fiction that truly reorganized human life? Not a simple story told for entertainment, but a belief strong enough to change behavior across a group, strong enough to enforce cooperation, to justify exclusion, to make sacrifice feel necessary. And once such a fiction exists, what prevents it from being shaped, subtly, steadily, by those who benefit most from controlling what it means? A fiction strong enough to reorganize life does not need to announce itself as fiction. It can feel like the most solid thing in the world because it is shared. When many minds hold the same invisible rule, the rule begins to behave like gravity. It shapes movement without being seen. In the late Pleistocene, the first such rules may have been simple. Who may eat first, who may marry whom, which places are dangerous, which animals must be treated with care. But once rules become shared and enforceable, they can grow more elaborate, and the human mind becomes a habitat for systems larger than any individual. This is where the social brain enters, not as a metaphor, but as a serious attempt to explain why humans became so unusually good at living inside other people's expectations. One influential line of thought argues that human cognition expanded to manage relationships, alliances, rivalries, obligations, reputation, and the constant negotiation of trust. In this view, the mind is less a solitary genius and more a crowded room. It tracks faces, tones, histories, debts. It runs simulations not only of hunting routes but of conversations, accusations, reconciliations. It predicts what others will do, and it also predicts what others think about what it will do. These capacities would have mattered intensely as groups grew and networks thickened. In a small band, social information is relatively stable. Everyone knows everyone's past. But when bands interact more often, through trade, competition, intermarriage, and migration, the social field becomes turbulent. Reputation becomes a currency that can be earned, spent, and stolen. Cooperation becomes valuable, yet fragile. A single act of betrayal can poison trust. In that context, the ability to read intention and manage reputation becomes as critical as skill with tools. Some researchers frame this as Machiavellian intelligence, a phrase that can sound cynical but points to an honest possibility. Social life selects for minds that can navigate politics, even in the absence of formal institutions. Politics here does not mean elections or palaces. It means the distribution of influence, the formation of coalitions, the enforcement of norms. A group that can coordinate punishment against defectors can cooperate more effectively. A group that can maintain fairness, at least the appearance of fairness, can reduce internal conflict. These are cognitive achievements, and they rely on shared attention and shared judgment. Language amplifies all of this, but the engine may be older and deeper. The human sensitivity to being watched. Even a subtle cue of observation can change behavior. Shame and pride become internal regulators. In later societies, institutions formalize surveillance through laws and gods. In earlier contexts, the watchers may have been entirely human, neighbours, elders, rivals, yet the psychological effect can be similar. If reputation determines survival, then the fear of social judgment becomes a force that shapes choices. This could help explain why symbolic systems became powerful. A symbol is a way to broadcast commitment. It can show loyalty, signal trustworthiness, demonstrate conformity to group norms. Ritual can function similarly. By participating, an individual proves alignment. A person who refuses a ritual becomes suspicious. A person who violates a taboo becomes dangerous. These dynamics can bind a group, especially under ecological stress, but they can also create pressure to conform. The cognitive revolution, in this frame, becomes less about abstract intelligence and more about the invention of social reality. Humans begin to live inside systems of obligation, that exist only because people agree they exist. This agreement is maintained by emotion, fear of exclusion, desire for belonging, pride in identity, dread of shame. In a volatile world, belonging is safety, exclusion is peril. Yet the social brain theory, like all theories of deep time, risks becoming a mirror. It can reflect modern anxieties about politics and manipulation back onto the past. It can overemphasize competition and underemphasize care. It can treat cooperation as merely strategic. And there is evidence that care is ancient and real. The survival of injured individuals in the archaeological record suggests social support. The long dependency of children requires collective investment. The human world has always contained tenderness, not only calculation. So the most responsible approach is to hold both sides without forcing resolution. Social intelligence can serve care and control simultaneously. A mind that understands others can comfort them. It can also exploit them. A story can soothe fear. It can also harness fear. The same cognitive capacities that allow empathy can allow manipulation. This duality is not a flaw in the theory. It is part of the human condition. If early symbolic systems stabilized cooperation, they may also have created a new kind of hierarchy. Not necessarily wealth or territory, but influence over meaning. A skilled hunter might earn respect. A skilled storyteller might earn something subtler, the ability to frame events. When drought comes, is it misfortune or punishment? When prey disappears, is it chance or taboo violation? Explanations can guide behavior. Those who provide explanations can shape group decisions. This is where the possibility of proto-religious cognition becomes relevant without requiring a fully formed religion. Humans are pattern-seeking. In uncertain environments, pattern-seeking intensifies. Agency detection, the tendency to perceive intention behind events, can be adaptive, because it is safer to assume a rustle is a predator than to assume it is wind. But agency detection can also spill into the invisible. Storms can feel angry. Illness can feel targeted. The world becomes populated not only by animals and weather, but by intentions. Even if such perceptions are not true in a literal sense, they can shape behavior in ways that improve group cohesion and caution. A shared belief in invisible agents can strengthen moral norms. If people believe they are watched by more than humans, then cooperation can become easier to enforce. In later history, moralizing gods become explicit. In deep prehistory, the watchers could be ancestors, spirits, or simply the collective gaze of the group imagined as something larger than any person. The mechanism is what matters, an internalized sense of accountability to an invisible audience. This would be an extraordinary cognitive step, not necessarily because it is metaphysically profound, but because it allows large-scale coordination. It allows individuals to follow rules even when no one is physically present to punish them. It makes invisible norms real. It turns imagination into governance. And governance is not always gentle. When norms become powerful, dissent becomes dangerous. A group under stress may prioritize unity over inquiry. A persuasive narrative may override competing interpretations. The capacity for skepticism, so prized in modern science, may be socially costly in small bands that depend on cohesion. In this way, the cognitive tools that allow cultural accumulation may also create cultural rigidity. So the question of a trigger becomes tangled with the question of consequence. If the cognitive revolution involved the intensification of social intelligence, then it did not simply give humans better tools. It gave them a new arena, the arena of shared belief, social surveillance, and identity systems. That arena is where later civilizations build laws, priesthoods, empires, and archives. The late Pleistocene may be the quiet beginning of that trajectory, but the fog does not allow certainty. The artifacts are sparse, the interpretations are contested. The mind wants a clear origin, yet the past offers only hints and probabilities. Still, a direction becomes visible. As symbols become more frequent and networks more connected, the social world gains gravity. people begin to carry not only tools but expectations, not only food but stories about what food means, not only fear of predators but fear of shame. And that leaves one question suspended, like a thread that refuses to settle. If early humans learned to cooperate at scale through shared beliefs and social regulation, what was the first experience? Fear, awe, grief, hunger that made an invisible rule feel more real than immediate reality? What emotion, in other words, first taught the human mind to obey what it could not see? Fear may have been the first teacher, but awe might have been the first persuader. Hunger forces the body to move. Awe can make a body stand still. In the deep past, the natural world offered countless opportunities for awe. Storms that arrived like living walls, eclipses that stole the sun, migrations of animals that turned the horizon into motion. Such experiences can rewire attention. They can make a group fall quiet together, feeling the same smallness at the same moment. And in shared silence, a rule can be born. Do not mock this place. Do not hunt this animal. Do not cross that ridge at night. Do not speak the name aloud. Yet awe alone does not build a revolution. It must become repeatable. It must be carried into ordinary days. That is where technology returns, not as cold machinery, but as cognition made visible. Tools are memory. Tools are decisions stored in matter. When a stone blade is shaped to a certain angle, it is an inheritance of technique. When a spear point is hafted to a shaft, it is an inheritance of planning. Each technical step implies a chain of knowledge that must be learned, remembered, and taught. The late Pleistocene record shows more of these chains. Composite tools, those made from multiple parts, suggest that humans were thinking in sequences rather than in single strikes. Hafting requires adhesives and bindings, and adhesives can require controlled heating, material selection, timing, and patience. None of this is mystical. It is procedural intelligence. But procedural intelligence grows more powerful when it is supported by language, shared norms, and long apprenticeship. A group that can preserve and refine multi-step techniques can outcompete a group that repeatedly reinvents them. Some archaeologists point to heat treatment of stone in certain traditions as a sign of sophisticated understanding. Heating can change the fracture properties of stone, making it easier to flake in predictable ways. But to heat stone deliberately is to hold an abstract model. The stone will behave differently after a controlled transformation. This is experimental thinking. It suggests curiosity, observation, and the ability to plan across time. The presence of such behaviour does not prove modern cognition began at a specific date, but it does suggest that cognition was being expressed through increasingly complex practices. There is also the quiet matter of risk. Many complex tools are investments. They take time to make, and time has a cost. In harsh environments, spending time on elaborate preparation can be dangerous unless the return is worth it. So when complex tools become more common, it may imply that humans had developed strategies to buffer risk through cooperation, food sharing, storage, and social support. Technology and social structure rise together. A lone individual cannot easily maintain complex traditions. A network can. This network is visible not only in tools but in movement. The spread of certain materials across distances suggests exchange or transport. A particular stone source appearing far from its origin implies travel routes and perhaps relationships between groups. These relationships can carry more than objects. They can carry techniques and stories. In this sense, a blade is not just a tool. It is a messenger of connectivity. Once connectivity increases, ideas begin to compete. Styles can spread because they are functional, but they can also spread because they signal identity. A tool can become a badge as much as an instrument. In later human history, fashion and function intertwine constantly. There is no reason to assume deep prehistory was immune. A group might adopt a certain point style because it works, but also because it marks them as part of a wider alliance network. Technology becomes social language. This social language can, in turn, affect cognition. When people live in a world where objects carry identity, they begin to think in categories that extend beyond immediate use. They begin to notice patterns and conventions. They begin to anticipate how others interpret what they carry. The mind becomes less private. It becomes a participant in a shared interpretive system. And still, the central question persists. What triggered the shift toward cumulative complexity? It may not be a single event, but technology offers a clue. As techniques become multi-step, they demand better teaching and stronger attention. The human mind must hold sequences and contingencies. It must remember not only what worked, but why. It must communicate procedures. It must maintain standards. These are cognitive pressures that can shape both culture and learning. Some researchers have suggested that once humans began to rely on complex foraging strategies, broad-spectrum diets, fishing, trapping, seasonal scheduling, the need for planning and knowledge storage increased. A group that can remember the seasonal availability of resources, the behavior of prey, the location of water, and the timing of plant cycles gains an advantage. This is ecological intelligence. It is not necessarily symbolic, but it provides a scaffold upon which symbolism can attach. When memory becomes central, stories become storage devices. Narratives encode landscapes. Myths can serve as maps. Taboos can protect resources. Ritual calendars can synchronize group movement. Symbolism becomes practical. This is why the boundary between myth and tool can be misleading. A myth can hold ecological information in a memorable form. A ritual can coordinate behavior. A taboo can regulate consumption. In such cases, symbolic systems are not mere ornamentation. They are survival strategies disguised as meaning. But symbolic systems can also detach from practical grounding and become autonomous. A rule can persist long after its original ecological justification is forgotten. A taboo can harden into identity. A ritual can become a test of loyalty rather than a coordination mechanism. This autonomy is powerful. It allows culture to persist through changing environments, but it also allows culture to become rigid, controlling, and resistant to evidence. The same mechanism that makes a story memorable can make it unquestionable. So technology becomes a double signal. On one hand, it demonstrates cumulative learning and planning. On the other hand, it hints at the social structures that allow cumulative learning to persist. Structures that likely involve norms, reputations, and shared meanings. A multi-step tool implies a multi-step society. In that light, the cognitive revolution may be the moment when humans began to inhabit systems that outlived individuals. Tools outlived their makers. Rules outlived their inventors. Stories outlived their original contexts. The human world began to accumulate layers like sediment, and sediment can bury as well as preserve. Once layers exist, they can hide earlier layers. A new tool tradition can replace an older one and erase it. A new identity system can rewrite old alliances. A new story can reframe old events. Even without writing, culture can edit itself. The archive is living, therefore it can be selective. That brings the mystery back to its most unsettling form. If early technology and symbolism formed a self-reinforcing loop, better tools enabling larger networks enabling stronger symbols enabling more stable cooperation, then the trigger might have been a small shift that tipped the loop into acceleration. A slight increase in population density, a corridor of ecological opportunity, a change in mobility that increased contact, a tradition that spread and stabilized teaching. If so, then the revolution is not a single spark but a threshold in feedback. And the question that waits, quietly, is this. What was the first feedback loop powerful enough to carry human culture beyond the reach of forgetting? What combination of tool, story, and social rule first made the human archive durable enough to survive the planet's indifference? A durable archive does not have to be carved in stone. It can be carved into timing, into breath, into the way bodies move together in the dark. If there is one medium that can survive even when objects rot and camps drown, it is rhythm. Because rhythm lives inside people, and people carry it across landscapes without needing to store it anywhere else. This is why sound enters the mystery like a hidden corridor. Archaeology struggles to recover language and nearly fails to recover music, yet many researchers suspect that coordinated sound and movement may have been among the earliest technologies of social cohesion. A group that can synchronize through chant, clapping, stomping, humming, can regulate emotion, it can dampen panic, it can build trust through shared tempo, and in volatile environments trust is not decoration, it is infrastructure. Some scientists study synchrony in modern humans and notice something that feels almost ancient. When people move together, they often feel closer, more cooperative, more willing to sacrifice for the group. This is not mystical. It is measurable in psychology experiments. Synchrony can increase prosocial behavior. It can reduce perceived distance between individuals. It can create a sense of belonging. If such effects exist now, it is plausible that they existed in earlier humans too, perhaps even more strongly in small groups where cohesion was a matter of survival. A chant does more than create unity. It creates memory. Patterns of sound are easier to recall than raw information. A rule embedded in rhythm becomes harder to forget. A story sung becomes more portable than a story spoken. In later societies, epics preserve genealogies, laws and histories across centuries without writing. It is not unreasonable to imagine that early humans used rhythmic narrative as storage, an archive of knowledge carried in the nervous system, reinforced by repetition, shared across gatherings. This possibility reshapes the trigger question. Perhaps the cognitive shift was not first expressed as art objects or beads, but as soundscapes, lullabies that taught infants the contours of language, chants that coordinated hunters, rhythms that soothed fear after a storm, shared songs that preserved roots and seasons. If early symbolic life lived primarily in performance, then the archaeological record would naturally underrepresent it. The revolution might be partly invisible because its earliest artifacts were not objects, but events. There is also the body. Humans learn through movement. Skills are embodied. A complex technique, hafting a point, mixing an adhesive, requires motor sequences that are best taught through demonstration and imitation, often accompanied by vocal cues. Rhythm can scaffold learning. It can structure sequences, do this, then this, then this. In this way, sound and technology intertwine. The mind becomes procedural, but the procedure becomes shareable. Some researchers also argue that music could have served as a social signal, proof of coordination and commitment. Singing together requires attention and tolerance. It is hard to fake over long periods. Participating in group performance can be a costly signal that one is invested in the group. Costly signals matter because they reduce the risk of deception. In social systems where trust is vital, costly signals become tools for alliance building. If that is true, then the emergence of coordinated performance could have helped stabilize expanding networks. Strangers can share a rhythm before they share a language fully. A shared beat can create a bridge. Over time, shared performance can evolve into shared ritual, and ritual can enforce norms in ways that are both gentle and strict. Gentle because it feels communal, strict because it punishes deviation through shame or exclusion. Here, the thread of control becomes clearer without becoming sensational. Once performance becomes ritual, ritual can become governance. A group can decide who may participate. It can decide who leads. It can decide what the ritual means. Those decisions create hierarchy. Not necessarily permanent hierarchy, but influence. In later civilizations, ritual authority becomes institutional. In earlier contexts, it may have been fluid, negotiated, tied to charisma, experience, or perceived spiritual power. Yet the cognitive mechanism is similar. Shared performance creates shared belief, and shared belief can be directed. This raises a question that is difficult to answer with evidence, but difficult to avoid in logic. Could the earliest large-scale cooperation have been built less on rational planning and more on emotional synchronization? If fear and scarcity drove humans into contact, synchrony could have made contact tolerable. A group that can regulate collective emotion can survive crises without fracturing. A group that can transform panic into ritual can maintain cohesion. Under stress. If so, then the trigger is partly physiological. Rhythms entrain breathing and heart rate. Shared singing can alter stress responses. Dance can release tension. These are not abstractions, they are bodily states. The cognitive revolution, in this lens, is not only an expansion of thought, but an expansion of collective regulation, humans learning to manage their own nervous systems through shared culture. The archaeological hints of this are indirect but intriguing. Evidence for repeated gatherings at certain sites, patterns of hearth use, long-term occupations that suggest social centrality, and later, musical instruments like bone flutes. The flutes themselves appear later than the proposed revolution window in many narratives, but the presence of instruments is not the beginning of music, only the beginning of durable music artifacts. Music likely existed long before instruments that could survive. The instrument is the fossil of an older practice. This returns the story to the central paradox. What appears suddenly in the record may be the fossilized residue of behaviors that existed earlier in less preservable forms. Symbols may have been painted on skin rather than stone. Songs may have carried myths long before myths were carved. Ritual may have coordinated groups long before any grave goods were placed. The revolution becomes the moment when these behaviors became frequent and stable enough to leave more durable traces, and with stability comes layering. A rhythm becomes a tradition becomes identity. Identity becomes boundary becomes conflict. The same synchrony that creates unity can also create division. Those who share the chant belong. Those who do not are outsiders. This is the shadow side of cohesion. Every we implies a they. So the trigger question shifts again into a softer but sharper form. If collective sound and ritual helped humans stabilize networks and carry memory, then the revolution may have been less about solitary genius and more about shared trance, shared attention, shared tempo, shared emotional meaning. The human species may have crossed a threshold where it could build large-scale cooperation by synchronizing minds, not just by sharing food, and the next layer waits like an unanswered chord. If rhythm and ritual were early engines of cohesion, what did early humans synchronize around? A hunt? A burial? The fear of catastrophe? The awe of the sky? And if shared performance can make invisible rules feel real, then when did humans first begin to treat those rules as sacred, beyond negotiation, beyond questioning, beyond the ordinary reach of doubt? Sacredness is a strange invention, because it is not exactly an invention at all. It is a mood that hardens. It is an emotional coating applied to certain rules until those rules feel untouchable. A taboo can begin as a practical guideline and end as a cosmic law. A ritual can begin as coordination and end as destiny. When something becomes sacred, it no longer needs to be argued for. It becomes the kind of thing people defend as if defending their own breath. The deep past offers no written doctrine to confirm when sacredness began. But it offers clues about when humans began to treat the invisible as if it carried weight. Burials, pigments, repeated gatherings, ornaments, and the probable growth of ritual performance all point toward a mind capable of more than immediate survival. They point toward a mind that could hold symbolic obligations. The question is, what emotion made those obligations feel necessary? Fear is a candidate, but fear alone produces avoidance. Sacredness often produces approach as well. Approach with caution, approach with offerings, approach with reverence. Awe can produce approach. Grief can produce approach. The death of a loved one is one of the most powerful experiences for forcing the mind beyond the visible. A body that was once warm becomes cold. A voice becomes absent. The mind insists on continuity, even when the senses provide none. Grief demands explanation, and explanation is the seedbed of invisible worlds. In that seedbed, ancestors become plausible, not as metaphysical facts, but as social facts. The dead can remain socially present through memory, through stories, through rules attributed to them. Ancestor reverence can regulate behavior. Do not violate the place where the dead rest. Do not break the taboo that keeps the group safe. Do not betray kinship obligations. In later societies, such reverence becomes elaborate religion. In earlier contexts, it could have been intimate and local, yet still potent. A rule tied to ancestors is harder to dismiss than a rule tied to convenience. There is also the sky. The night sky is a universal screen for pattern seeking. It offers cycles and surprises, seasons, lunar phases, meteors, eclipses. Even without astronomy, humans would have noticed regularities. Regularities invite meaning. A predictable cycle can become a calendar for rituals, migrations, and resource timing. A rare event can become a sign. A group that shares interpretations of the sky gains coordination and cohesion. The sky becomes a shared reference point, larger than any individual. This does not require assuming that early humans invented complex cosmologies overnight. It requires only that they lived with a world that was often unpredictable, and that they were social creatures who sought shared explanations. When shared explanations reduce anxiety and improve coordination, they are reinforced. Children learn them. Rituals embed them. The explanations become part of identity. At this point, the cognitive revolution begins to look like the growth of interpretive frameworks. Humans were not merely reacting, they were narrating. They were building causal models that could be shared. In modern science, causal models are tested. In prehistory, causal models may have been tested socially. Did the ritual bring unity? Did the taboo prevent disaster? Did the story keep children from wandering into danger? A story that helps a group survive does not need to be literally true to be adaptive. It needs to be useful. But usefulness can be a trap. A useful story can become unquestionable. Once a story becomes sacred, it gains immunity. It can no longer be revised easily, even when circumstances change. This is the paradox of cultural durability. The mechanisms that preserve knowledge also preserve error. A taboo that once protected a scarce resource might continue even when the resource is abundant. A ritual that once coordinated hunting might persist long after hunting changes. Sacredness stabilizes, but it can also fossilize. Some researchers argue that religion-like cognition may have been favored because it increased cooperation. Shared belief can reduce internal conflict and increase trust. If individuals believe that moral violations have invisible consequences, they may behave more reliably. In later human history, moralizing gods are strongly associated with large-scale societies, though the relationship is debated and complex. In earlier periods, the Watchers might have been less moralizing and more situational. Spirits tied to places, ancestors tied to kin groups, forces tied to the hunt. Yet even local Watchers can shape behavior. This is where the thread of control becomes difficult to ignore. If sacred stories regulate behavior, then those who interpret sacred stories gain influence. Again, there is no need to imagine secret councils or organized priesthoods in the late Pleistocene. Influence can exist without institutions. A healer who claims to know why illness struck, a storyteller who frames misfortune as punishment for a broken taboo, an elder who declares that certain acts anger the invisible. These roles can emerge naturally, especially under stress. They can help a group survive. They can also concentrate power. The cognitive revolution, then, is not only about imagination, but about governance through meaning. A group that can enforce norms through sacred narratives can coordinate more effectively than one that relies only on immediate force. Yet such enforcement can also become harsh. A person accused of violating a taboo might be ostracized. A dissenting interpretation might be punished. Unity can be maintained by fear, and fear, once tied to sacredness, becomes something deeper than fear of predators. It becomes fear of being out of alignment with reality as the group defines it. That is a profound psychological shift. It creates internal policing. It makes people police each other. It makes deviation feel dangerous not only socially but cosmically. At the same time, sacredness can be gentle. Ritual can comfort grief. Stories can soothe the terror of death. Shared explanations can soften helplessness. Sacredness can be a form of emotional technology, a way to hold pain in a container, to make loss survivable, to make uncertainty bearable. The truth is likely both. Sacredness as comfort, sacredness as constraint. The archaeological record cannot tell which dominated. It can only suggest that humans were increasingly capable of symbolic obligation. The rest is inference, careful, humble, haunted by projection. Yet the direction remains visible. As networks expanded, as language and ritual intensified, the invisible began to govern the visible. And now the question sharpens into a form that cannot be answered with a single fossil. If sacredness helped stabilize cooperation and protect knowledge, it may have been one of the most powerful engines of cumulative culture. But if sacredness also made certain stories immune to challenge, it could have shaped which versions of reality survived even in oral form. So the next layer of fog carries an uneasy thought. Once humans learned to make rules sacred, they also learned to make meanings durable beyond evidence. When did the capacity for sacred narrative become strong enough to outlive experience, to persist, even when the world contradicted it? And if that capacity was already growing tens of thousands of years ago, what does it suggest about the long future that followed? Civilizations built on stories, and stories powerful enough to rewrite what people are allowed to remember. A story that outlives experience begins to behave like a lens. People look through it and believe they're seeing the world directly, forgetting the glass is there. In later ages, lenses are crafted deliberately, by states, by priesthoods, by schools, by archives that decide what is preserved and what is quietly discarded. In the deep past, there were no archives in the usual sense, yet there was still selection. Which stories were repeated, which practices were taught, which symbols were treated as legitimate, which interpretations were allowed to stand. This is why the very phrase cognitive revolution deserves suspicion. Not because it is meaningless, but because it is powerful. It creates a clean turning point, a dramatic before and after. It offers the comfort of a single doorway into modernity. But many researchers have spent decades complicating that doorway. They have pointed out that what was once framed as a sudden Upper Paleolithic revolution was heavily shaped by the European record, where cave art, elaborate tools, and visible symbolism are spectacular and abundant. When that record became the template, other regions were implicitly treated as late arrivals, not because they were necessarily late, but because the evidence was different, less preserved, or less excavated. As more discoveries accumulated in Africa and beyond, the picture began to soften. Symbolic traces, pigments, ornaments, engraved pieces appeared earlier than the old European-centered narrative predicted. The transformation looked less like a single leap and more like a long, uneven unfolding. The revolution began to resemble a slow tide, arriving in pulses, sometimes retreating, sometimes surging forward again. This shift in perspective is not merely academic. It demonstrates how easily a story about origins can be shaped by where scholars have looked and what they have valued as evidence. A cave painting is compelling. It feels like an unmistakable confession of imagination. A pigment-stained tool is easier to dismiss as practical. A burial is easy to romanticize. A missing coastline is easy to forget. When a discipline privileges certain forms of spectacle, it risks building a timeline that reflects aesthetic impact rather than true sequence. In that sense, the cognitive revolution may partly be a story about modern knowledge systems, their habits, their blind spots, their inherited frames. The past does not step forward and announce its categories. Humans impose categories on it. And once a category becomes familiar, it can become self-reinforcing. Funding follows it. Fieldwork is designed around it. Museum narratives repeat it. A turning point becomes an institution. None of this requires conspiracy. It requires only the normal machinery of human attention. Yet it produces an unsettling echo. The same cognitive capacities that once allowed humans to create shared myths also allow modern humans to create shared academic myths. A myth in this sense is not a falsehood. It is a simplifying narrative that organizes meaning. It can be revised, but only with effort, and often only after long resistance. The resistance is understandable, because the alternative is messier. A mosaic past means that there may not be one trigger. It means multiple thresholds, reached under different ecological and social conditions. It means that modern behavior might be a bundle of traits that do not necessarily travel together. Symbolic ornamentation, complex tools, long-distance exchange, structured burials, ritual performance, and perhaps intensified language. A group could develop one element strongly while another remained subtle. A region could foster complex social networks without leaving dramatic art. Another region could preserve dramatic art in caves simply because caves existed. When the story becomes mosaic, a different question emerges. Why do modern humans crave a revolution at all? The answer may lie in the way minds handle deep time. Gradual change across tens of thousands of years is hard to feel. It does not satisfy narrative hunger. A revolution is easier to tell. It has shape. It has drama. It offers a moment where the human becomes human, where the listener can place a finger on a map and say, "Here, it happened here." But if that desire for a clean origin is itself a product of symbolic consciousness, then the story becomes reflexive. The cognitive revolution is partly what modern minds do to the past. They turn it into a narrative with a climax, because that is how humans remember and communicate. In other words, the revolution may be as much a storytelling device as it is a biological or cultural event. This does not mean nothing changed. It means the way change is packaged matters, and packaging can obscure as much as it reveals. When a discipline frames a turning point too sharply, it can hide earlier complexity and exaggerate later novelty. When it frames too loosely, it can dissolve meaningful patterns into endless ambiguity. The challenge is to hold uncertainty without letting it become emptiness. Some scholars have tried to resolve this by shifting attention from firsts to persistence. Instead of asking when symbolism first appeared, they ask when it became widespread and stable enough to endure across generations and regions. Instead of asking when language began, they ask when language became powerful enough to support large-scale cooperation and cumulative culture. Persistence is a different kind of threshold, and it aligns with the earlier suspicion that the decisive change may have been demographic and network-based rather than purely neurological. Yet even persistence can be misleading if the archive is uneven. A behaviour can be widespread and still be underrepresented if it leaves perishable traces. A behaviour can be localised and still seem prominent if it is preserved in a fortunate site. This is why the story remains haunted by missing coastlines, missing fibres, missing songs, missing gestures. The deeper one looks, the more one realises that the most human things may be the least recoverable, and still the discipline must speak. It cannot remain silent forever. It must propose explanations, even if they are provisional. It must decide what counts as evidence, even if the decision is imperfect. In doing so, it inevitably shapes public understanding of human origins. A term like cognitive revolution becomes not only a hypothesis, but a cultural story that influences how people imagine themselves. That influence matters, because origin stories shape identity. If humans believe they were suddenly awakened by a single trigger, they may underestimate the slow work of accumulation and the fragility of cultural memory. If they believe progress is natural and inevitable, they may ignore how easily networks can thin and knowledge can collapse. If they believe a single breakthrough made civilization possible, they may overlook the countless small acts of teaching, caring, and coordinating that made any breakthrough survivable. So the fog thickens again, but it thickens around a new kind of suspicion, that the central mystery is not only what triggered the cognitive revolution, but what modern humans are doing when they insist on naming one. Is the name itself a kind of sacred story? An academic myth that comforts by offering an origin and a boundary? And that leaves an uneasy question hanging, one that does not accuse anyone of dishonesty, yet refuses complacency. If deep history can be reshaped by the places we excavate and the categories we inherit, then what else might be missing, not because it never existed, but because it does not fit the lens? What other human thresholds might have occurred, quietly, unevenly, repeatedly, only to be flattened into a single dramatic moment that the modern mind can tolerate? A lens that becomes too familiar starts to feel like eyesight itself. When that happens, the mind stops noticing what it is excluding. In the search for the cognitive revolution, exclusion can take a subtle form. The tendency to privilege artifacts over biology, or biology over artifacts, as if one domain must hold the true key. Yet human evolution is rarely polite enough to separate these things. Bodies shape culture. Culture shapes bodies. And both are braided through development, especially through the long, pliable years of childhood. This is why genetics and development enter the story like a late-arriving witness, not because they can testify clearly about specific behaviours 70,000 years ago, but because they can reveal constraints and potentials. They can suggest what kinds of changes are plausible, and what kinds of single-trigger narratives are less likely. The public imagination often fixates on a single gene. FOXP2 is the most famous example, because a single gene feels like a clean switch. But gene networks do not behave like light bulbs. FOXP2 is involved in speech and language-related pathways, yet it is not a language gene in the simplistic sense. Variants of FOXP2 and related regulatory changes appear in complex timelines, and related capacities may exist in other hominins. The lesson is not that genes do not matter, but that genes rarely hand over a single dramatic culprit. A more subtle and arguably more powerful possibility is developmental timing. Small shifts in how long the brain remains plastic, how long childhood lasts, and how social learning is structured can produce enormous changes in cultural capacity without requiring a sudden leap in raw intelligence. Humans already have an unusually extended childhood compared to many species. That extended childhood creates time for learning complex skills and absorbing social norms. If that window lengthened slightly, or if social environments became slightly more supportive of long apprenticeships, the effect on cumulative culture could be immense. This is not a romantic claim. It follows a practical logic. Many complex behaviours cannot be learned quickly. Tool-making techniques that require multi-step planning, ecological knowledge that requires seasonal memory, social rules that require nuanced understanding, all demand time. A species that invests more in prolonged learning can build deeper cultural reservoirs. In that frame, the revolution could be a shift in how humans became human. Not a new capacity appearing from nowhere, but a longer runway for capacities already present. Such shifts could be driven by ecology and social structure as much as by genes. If cooperation increased, childcare could become more communal. If food sharing became more reliable, children could be supported longer. If group stability improved, the risks of prolonged dependency could be reduced. That stability might be linked to technology, climate corridors, or network connectivity, once again turning the story into feedback loops rather than single events. Genetics also offers a second angle: population structure. When populations expand and diversify, genetic variation increases. When populations contract, variation can shrink. But cultural change can occur even without dramatic genetic change, simply because learning opportunities change. Still, genetics can hint at migration patterns and interbreeding events that reshape networks. The late Pleistocene was not a simple stage with a single human actor. It involved multiple hominin groups interacting in ways that are still being revealed through ancient DNA and comparative genomics. This matters because contact can be cognitively transformative without being genetically transformative. When groups meet, they exchange not only mates, but ideas. They borrow techniques, symbols, and stories. Cultural hybridization can generate innovation. It can also generate identity boundaries. It can increase the need for markers, rituals, and reputational systems. In other words, interaction itself can be a pressure for symbolic complexity. At the same time, the existence of other hominins complicates the uniqueness story. If close relatives, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others, show signs of symbolic behavior, then the capacity for symbolism may be older and broader than any one date suggests. Some evidence suggests Neanderthals used pigments, ornaments, and perhaps engaged in ritual-like behaviours, though interpretations remain debated. The point is not to claim equivalence, but to weaken the temptation to treat symbolic thought as a sudden gift granted to one lineage at one moment. If symbolic capacity is widespread, then the trigger question shifts again. Perhaps the decisive change was not the invention of symbolism, but the scaling of it. Its integration into large connected networks, its stabilization through prolonged learning and social reinforcement. A mind can be capable of symbolism, yet rarely express it in ways that survive, especially if life is harsh and networks are thin. Development also brings attention to the brain's architecture. Human brains are energetically expensive. They require high-quality nutrition and strong social support. A slight shift in diet, in foraging efficiency, or in cooperative provisioning could support larger brain development and longer learning phases without requiring an abrupt genetic transformation. Such changes could be gradual and regionally variable, aligning with the mosaic nature of the archaeological record. And then there is the question of imagination itself, not as a mystical property, but as a cognitive skill that can be shaped by environment. Children raised in richer social and symbolic environments develop more complex narrative abilities. They learn to model others' minds. They absorb norms, metaphors, and categories. If late Pleistocene societies began to generate denser symbolic worlds, more rituals, more ornaments, more shared stories, then children would have grown up inside stronger scaffolds for imagination. Culture would be building cognition, even as cognition builds culture. This is perhaps the most unsettling possibility of all, because it dissolves the desire for a clean trigger. It suggests that what triggered the revolution was the revolution itself, an accelerating loop in which small increases in symbolic behavior enriched social environments, which enriched learning, which increased symbolic behavior, which further enriched social environments. In such loops, there is no single moment where one can say, "Here it began." There is only a tipping into momentum, yet momentum can be mistaken for inevitability. A loop can reverse if conditions worsen. Childhood can shorten under stress. Networks can fragment. Teaching can fail. The human archive can thin. The fact that cumulative culture eventually flourished does not mean it could not have collapsed. The deep past may contain many collapses that are invisible, because collapses erase the very evidence needed to recognize them. So genetics and development do not provide a simple answer. They provide a sobering constraint. They suggest that human change is likely to have been subtle, distributed, and entangled with ecology and culture. They caution against the fantasy of a single mutation that turned animals into poets. They invite a quieter understanding that the human mind is built slowly, through bodies and relationships, through childhood and teaching, through networks that either preserve learning or let it dissolve. And now the question becomes more personal, more fragile. If the revolution depended on prolonged learning and dense symbolic environments, then it depended on care, on adults investing in children, on communities supporting the vulnerable. The most profound trigger might not have been catastrophe, but cooperation. That leaves one lingering uncertainty, soft but sharp. If cooperation and prolonged childhood help stabilize cumulative culture, then what first pushed humans into the kind of cooperation deep enough to sustain it? Was it fear of nature, or of the sky, the demands of technology, the pressure of strangers, or an older, quieter instinct that the species learned to trust? The instinct to care long enough for meaning to take root. Care is easy to praise and hard to measure. It leaves fewer durable traces than violence, yet it may have been the most decisive technology humans ever refined. A child who survives long enough to learn becomes a vessel for accumulated knowledge. A sick adult who is supported long enough to recover becomes a carrier of skill. A group that protects its members becomes a group that can afford long apprenticeships, complicated tools, and shared rituals. If the cognitive revolution depended on such social depth, then the trigger may have been not one event, but the slow expansion of human tolerance for interdependence. That expansion would have reshaped geography. A cooperating group can travel farther because it can share risk. It can explore new corridors because it can support failures. It can trade with strangers because it can negotiate rather than fight to exhaustion. In this way, cooperation turns into connectivity, and connectivity turns into a network that begins to span landscapes. When a network spans landscapes, the cognitive environment changes. People begin to encounter unfamiliar faces, unfamiliar tool styles, unfamiliar symbols. They begin to live in a world where information can arrive from far away, carried by objects and stories rather than by direct experience. This may be one of the most underappreciated thresholds, the moment strangers become possible. A stranger is not simply an unknown person. A stranger is a test of the mind's ability to generalize norms. In a small band, rules can be personal. The rule applies because it applies to that person with that history. In a larger world, rules must be abstract. The rule applies because it applies to a category. Categories are cognitive tools. They allow prediction in a complex social field. They also allow dehumanization, the ability to classify as both a triumph and a danger. Evidence for growing connectivity appears in the movement of materials and styles. Shells far inland, stones far from their sources, similar tool traditions across regions. Each suggests that people were not isolated points, but nodes linked by travel and exchange. Exchange does not necessarily imply peaceful trade in the modern sense, but it does imply contact sustained enough for objects and ideas to move. It implies paths. It implies repeated relationships. It implies a social landscape larger than a single home range. As social landscapes expand, cultural transmission changes character. A technique learned from another group can be adopted, refined, and passed on. A symbol borrowed can become reinterpreted. A ritual can spread and mutate. Over time, connectivity creates a kind of cultural evolution that accelerates beyond what any single isolated band could generate. Innovations can accumulate because they can be shared and compared. Failures can be abandoned because alternatives exist. The human world begins to feel like it has momentum. But momentum requires trust. Trust is not automatic between strangers. It must be signalled, tested and enforced. This is where symbolic markers and ritual practices likely gained strategic value. A shared ornament style can function as a credential. A shared ritual can function as proof of alignment. A taboo can function as a boundary marker. These are social technologies that allow networks to expand without dissolving into constant conflict. Still, networks are not only built by peaceful exchange, they can also be built by pressure. Competition for resources can force groups into alliances. Environmental corridors can funnel movement, increasing encounters. Climatic instability can push migrations that create contact zones. In such zones, cultural innovation can accelerate, because contact itself generates novelty. People learn by watching outsiders. They steal techniques. They adopt symbols. They hybridize. Hybridization has a psychological cost. When identity becomes fluid, groups often respond by making identity more explicit. Boundaries become sharper when they are threatened. Ritual becomes stricter when outsiders are near. Stories about origin become more important when lineage is contested. This could explain why symbolic systems become more salient precisely as networks expand. Connectivity does not dissolve identity, it often intensifies it. At this stage, the cognitive revolution begins to resemble a paradox of scale. To cooperate widely, humans need abstract rules and shared symbols. To protect coherence, humans also need boundaries and enforcement. The same network that allows cumulative culture also creates opportunities for manipulation, because controlling meaning becomes a way to control behavior. When strangers are present and choices multiply, the story that tells people who they are and what they must do becomes a powerful tool. The power of such stories is visible in later history, but the cognitive ingredients likely formed earlier. A story that binds a group to a shared ancestor can justify cooperation beyond immediate kin. A story that frames outsiders as dangerous can justify exclusion. A story that explains misfortune as punishment can enforce conformity. These are not merely beliefs, they are social engines. They regulate behavior across time and space. If the late Pleistocene world was becoming increasingly interconnected, then a new kind of vulnerability emerged, the vulnerability to large-scale narratives. A person can be persuaded not only by a leader standing nearby, but by a story that travels through the network. A story can outlive the original teller. It can recruit believers who never met the inventor. In this way, culture begins to behave like an independent force, propagating itself, competing with other stories, selecting for minds that transmit it effectively. This makes the trigger question feel almost inverted. Perhaps the decisive shift was not that humans invented better stories, but that stories found better habitats, larger networks, denser populations, longer childhoods, stronger ritual synchronization. Once the habitat existed, stories could evolve and spread in ways that transformed cognition from the outside in. Yet no habitat is stable forever. Networks can fracture, corridors can close, drought can isolate groups, rising seas can separate populations, disease can thin communities. Each disruption risks cultural loss, especially if knowledge becomes specialized. The more complex a system, the more it depends on continuous transmission. Complexity can be brittle. This brittleness returns the story to the edge of an older unease. If the cognitive revolution was driven by connectivity and cooperation, then it was also threatened by the planet's ability to fragment networks. Rising seas that drowned coastal plains could have severed routes. Climate swings could have turned contact zones into barriers. A network that once supported cumulative culture could collapse into isolated pockets, each losing pieces of shared knowledge. So the late Pleistocene may have been a dance between connection and fracture, between the expansion of social worlds and the Earth's habit of reshaping them. The revolution, if it was real, may have been the moment when connection began to dominate fracture, often enough for culture to accumulate faster than it was erased. And one question remains: like a path disappearing into fog. If networks allowed stories and techniques to persist, then what was the first network large enough to create a shared world beyond local experience? A world where people could believe in obligations to strangers, where symbols could travel and still be recognized, where identity could extend across landscapes. In other words, when did humanity first become not just a species, but a connected imagination spread across the earth? A connected imagination is a delicate thing. It can stretch across landscapes and still snap if the strain becomes too great. Yet once it exists, it alters the meaning of being human. A person no longer lives only among familiar faces and immediate needs. A person lives inside a wider web of expectations, stories, symbols, obligations, and fears that arrive from far away and linger long after the messenger is gone. That web is what later ages will call society, civilization, history. In the late Pleistocene, it may have been the first true environment made of meaning. If the cognitive revolution was a turning point, it may be because it made this environment durable enough to persist through disturbance. Not invincible, not immune to resets, but resilient enough that losses did not erase everything. The mind did not become a different species overnight. Rather, the human way of storing life outside the body, through cumulative culture, began to compound. The decisive shift could have been a threshold in feedback, enough connectivity for ideas to travel, enough stability for children to learn, enough ritual and language for norms to be enforced, enough shared symbolism for strangers to be integrated into a social map. This framework does not give the satisfaction of a single trigger. It offers something quieter and perhaps more honest, a convergence. Climate volatility pushes movement. Movement increases encounters. Encounters increase the value of identity signals and trust mechanisms. Trust mechanisms intensify ritual and shared narratives. Shared narratives stabilize cooperation. Stabilized cooperation supports prolonged childhood and apprenticeship. Apprenticeship strengthens technology and ecological knowledge. Better technology supports higher population density. Higher density thickens networks further. The loop accelerates. In such a system, a revolution is what a tipping point feels like when viewed from far away. The curve steepens. The pattern becomes visible. But inside the system there may be no moment of revelation, no dawn that announces itself. There may only be generations of people teaching children, negotiating alliances, mourning the dead, painting bodies, shaping tools, and repeating stories until those stories become the fabric of reality. The unsettling aspect of this convergence is that it creates the conditions for both extraordinary cooperation and extraordinary control. Once shared meanings govern behaviour, the struggle over meaning becomes a struggle over power. In later history this is obvious. Institutions build archives, define orthodoxies, punish heresy, and rewrite memory. In deep prehistory the scale is smaller, but the cognitive machinery is already present. Sacredness, reputational enforcement, costly signals, and synchronized ritual can bind a group and can also discipline it. This is why the trigger question cannot be separated from the consequences of being triggered. If the revolution was the stabilization of shared fictions, then it was also the beginning of a world where people could be moved by invisible rules. A species that can cooperate with strangers through shared stories can also be led into conflict through shared stories. The same mental architecture that enables empathy at scale can enable hatred at scale. The same narratives that soothe grief can justify exclusion. The mind becomes capable of building cathedrals of meaning and prisons of meaning. There is also a more silent consequence. Once humans live inside a shared symbolic environment, the past becomes vulnerable. Memory becomes communal, and communal memory can be edited, not always deliberately, but inevitably. Stories change with retelling. Certain versions are favoured because they support cohesion. Other versions fade because they threaten unity. even without writing, even without a centralized authority culture selects. It preserves what is useful, what is comforting, what is prestigious, what is feared. Over thousands of years, this selection can reshape the internal map of reality. This returns the listener to the beginning, to the torn page sensation. Perhaps the question, what triggered the cognitive revolution, is partly a question created by the very phenomenon it describes. A mind that lives in stories wants origins. It wants a beginning. It wants a moment when the human became human. But a species built by cumulative culture is built by gradients, by feedback loops, by countless small choices. The desire for a single trigger may be a modern echo of an ancient habit, the habit of compressing complexity into a narrative that can be carried. Still, the convergence framework does not have to be cold, it can be intimate. It suggests that the true engine of human transformation was not a miracle gene or a single catastrophe, but the daily labour of relationship, sharing food, caring for the injured, teaching children, maintaining trust, repeating rituals that calmed fear, preserving knowledge through story. It suggests that the cognitive revolution was, at its core, a social revolution, a change in how minds link together. And that brings a final, unsettling calm. If the revolution was a threshold in networked meaning, then it remains relevant, because human life is still lived inside that environment. Modern people still obey invisible rules, laws, currencies, national myths, moral codes. They still synchronize in rituals, songs, pledges, ceremonies, shared media events. They still transmit identities through symbols, flags, logos, clothing, language itself. The late Pleistocene does not feel distant in that sense. It feels like the first time the human mind learned the trick it still performs every day, turning shared imagination into real consequences. The mystery, then, does not end with a neat answer. It becomes a mirror held at an angle. The listener is left with a question that is less about 70,000 years ago and more about now. If the human world is governed by shared fictions that can stabilize cooperation and also enable control, how does anyone know when they are living in a story that helps them and when they are living in a story that is quietly using them? Perhaps the most haunting possibility is that the cognitive revolution did not simply happen and then finish. Perhaps it began a process that never stopped, the ongoing evolution of meaning, the ongoing competition between narratives, the ongoing fragility of collective memory. If so, then the trigger is not behind us, it is beneath us, supporting every modern certainty like a deep unseen foundation. And in the quiet space where conclusions would normally settle, only an image remains, soft, symbolic, and hard to shake, a shoreline at night, the sea rising, erasing footprints that were never recorded, somewhere inland, a fire. Around it, a circle of faces listening to a story that binds them together against the darkness. The story is comforting, and it is dangerous, and it is the only shelter they have. The question is whether anyone in the circle can tell the difference, and whether the circle ever could.